So we've got a lot of material to cover today. And before we get started, let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, we once again thank you for this opportunity. Father, we thank you for the freedom we have to discuss issues of critical importance, Lord, about who has the truth, who possesses the truth, and how can we know that? And Lord, as we look to the issue under discussion today about Muhammad, Father, we know that many Muslims around the world, 1.5 billion Muslims, believe him to be a prophet of God in the long line of prophets. And yet, Father, we know by looking at his life that that just cannot be so. And so, Lord, we ask you, as we go through this material today, Lord, that you would equip us to answer this critical question that Muslims are asking. That they might be, that their eyes might be opened to the truth of who Muhammad really was, and then the truth of who you are. So, Father, we ask you to give this, we ask you for your presence today, and we ask you to be with us as we absorb this material. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Now, just as a recap, for those who missed the first week that we were here, I talked about one of the issues that this class is not focused on. And I know some people weren't here that first week, so I want to reiterate, because this week, next week, and the week after, we're going to be talking about essentially what I call the two critical issues of Islam. Today we're going to be talking about Muhammad. In 2 weeks we're going to be talking about the Quran. And as I mentioned that first week, we're going to be putting both Muhammad and the Quran to the test. We're going to be examining them critically. Why do we do this? Well, first of all, let me say why we don't do this. We don't do this in order to be able to bash Muslims. We don't want to hit them over the head and say, look at this guy you're following. Nothing but a pedophile. You know, we hear that all the time. If you begin a conversation that way with a Muslim, you're immediately going to put up a brick wall. You're not going to have an opportunity to engage in further discussion. So you never want to begin a conversation with a Muslim by attacking either Muhammad or the Quran. But we are allowed to examine both Muhammad and the Quran with the idea of testing whether the claims that Islam makes for these two entities are in fact true. So we're not going to be engaging in bashing Muslims, but we are going to be putting them to a critical test. Today we're going to examine Muhammad's life critically. And we're going to answer the question, is he a prophet of God? Because that is a truth claim that Muslims make. And when you are asked, as you will be when you begin talking with Muslims, what do you think of Muhammad? Or what do you think of the Quran? I get asked that question all the time. You're going to have to be able to provide an answer to that question. But do so in a way that's not offensive, that is factual. Because when you present what you believe in a critical way, but it demonstrates that you put some thought into the subject, and you do it in a non-offensive way, but you do it in a very factual way, Muslims will respect you for that. But if you come across as just trying to bash them over the head, or baffle them with your brilliance or your intelligence, you're not going to get anywhere. So we're going to examine critically the life of Muhammad, because if he is a prophet of God, as Islam claims him to be, then we should pay attention to what he has to say. On the other hand, if he's not a prophet of God, then not only should we disregard what he has to say, but we should warn others who are actually giving heed to what he says. If it can be shown that he is indeed a false prophet, then we need to sound the warning. We're commanded to do so in the Bible. So, the real question that I want to answer today is, does Muhammad exhibit the qualities of a prophet? And what are those qualities? Is he a legitimate prophet of God as Islam claims him to be? Or is he something else? That's our goal for today. Remember, last week, or the week before, I talked about the two significant periods of early Islamic history, the Meccan period and Medina period. When Muhammad migrated to Medina, he actually presented himself to the Jewish clans of that area as another prophet of God in the long line of biblical prophets. Now, the Jews of Medina knew what a biblical prophet looked like. And it didn't take long for them to actually reject his claim. But why did they do so? Well, those are the criteria we're going to examine today. The Jews of Medina knew what a biblical prophet looked like. They knew what a biblical prophet said, did, lived, and acted like. So let's talk about Muhammad. Who is he? Who is this guy? Well, his name actually comes from the Arabic word Ahmad, which means one worthy of praise, the praiseworthy one. And this is significant because in a few weeks we're going to get into some of the common objections that Muslims raise regarding Christianity. And one of the objections they raise is, why don't you Christians believe in Muhammad? Because he's predicted in your Bible. You can find Muhammad's name mentioned in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to look at some of those scriptures. But one of the verses they point to, especially in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, is John 14:16. And they say that Muhammad's name is found in that particular verse. Now they say the Christians changed it and corrupted it so that it no longer says that, but the original Greek spoke of Muhammad coming as a prophet, and Jesus actually said he was going to send Muhammad. Where they get this argument from? Because they believe the original Greek used the Greek word for praised one, Muhammad's root name, Ahmad. And we'll show how that cannot be so when we get to that point. But this is one of the arguments that Muslims use. Muhammad's name means praised one, praiseworthy one, Ahmad. And they say the praiseworthy one can be found in the New Testament scriptures, quoted by Jesus himself. Muhammad is said to be the last and final messenger of God. Now it's interesting that what Muhammad was claiming in the 7th century, Joseph Smith was claiming in the 19th century. Joseph Smith said he was the final prophet of God, right? He was given a new revelation, just like Muhammad was. He was visited by an angel, just like Muhammad was. So what's to prevent somebody coming down the road, maybe next week or next month, making the same claim again? Hey, I had a visitation by an angel too, and he gave me a new revelation. You need to accept it. What are the criteria that we're going to use to determine whether that prophet is legitimate or not? The same criteria can be applied to Joseph Smith. The same criteria can be applied to Muhammad, because they make the same claims. Muhammad is said to be the model of behavior for all mankind. In Surah 33, verse 21, it says, "You have indeed in the apostle of Allah a beautiful pattern of conduct for anyone whose hope is in Allah in the final day, and who engages much in the praise of Allah." So Muslims use Muhammad as an example for the lifestyle that they should emulate. If Muhammad did it, then a true devout Muslim is supposed to do it as well. And I talked about that a couple weeks ago when we talked about what the Sunnah is. The Sunnah is the picture-perfect example of life that Muhammad set as a pattern for all of his followers to emulate. And that's based on this verse in the Quran. You have in the apostle of Allah a pattern of good conduct to follow. So anything that Muhammad did, Muslims are supposed to emulate as well. In every regard. How you're supposed to pray, how you're supposed to get out of bed in the morning, how you're supposed to cleanse yourself. And how do we know how Muhammad did all these things? It's not in the Quran. We look to the Hadith. And we talked about what the Hadith are, the multiple collections of traditions attributed to Muhammad. Things that are recorded about things that he said or did or gave approval to and so forth. So Muhammad is the pattern of conduct, and Muslims look to the Hadith to find out what that pattern of conduct actually looked like, so they can emulate it. Now I'm going to talk briefly about Muhammad's background, give you a little bit of his history. How many of you guys from this church were here like 2 weeks ago on a Wednesday night when Bill Federer was here? Okay. So you've heard a little bit of this. He went into a lot of background about Muhammad's past, his biography. A lot of that was taken from this biography of Muhammad himself, like Ibn Ishaq, that I've mentioned multiple times. He had a lot of good information. If you guys aren't familiar with his book, this is the book that he was talking about, Bill Federer. what every American needs to know about the Quran, a history of Islam in the United States. A lot of good history. And that's where he gets a lot of his information from. But let's talk briefly about Muhammad's background, because I'm going to kind of set the stage for what Muslims believe about him. In Mecca, Muhammad was born in Mecca around 570 A.D. This is disputable by critical scholars of Islam, critical historians, but the general consensus among Muslims is that he was born in Mecca about 570 A.D. Born to a very wealthy tribe, a very significant tribe, the Quraysh clan. The Quraysh clan was a very noble tribe, it was very wealthy, it had high regard, very highly respected. Supposedly, Muhammad's father, whose name was Abdullah. Abdullah means slave of God, Abd Allah, slave of God, so which seems to suggest that the name for God, Allah, was in use prior to Islamic times, and it was. It's not an Islamic invention. The name for God, Allah, had been in use for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was just one of the 360 pagan gods that the Meccans worshiped. But Muhammad's father was Abdullah. He died before Muhammad was born. His mother, Amina, died when Muhammad was 6 years old. So Muhammad was basically raised as an orphan. He had both of his natural parents died very early in life. He was raised at first by his uncle and then later by his grandfather. He used to travel on trips with his uncle and with his grandfather on caravan trips. They were involved in the trade business. And I mentioned the trade business a couple weeks ago. Trade was very lucrative in the Sinai Peninsula, or in the Arabian Peninsula, and especially Mecca. Mecca was considered a hub of commercial trading activity. And so Muhammad used to accompany his grandfather and his uncle on trading caravan routes between Mecca and up into Syria and back. Now, supposedly, according to his biographer, Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad can trace his lineage through his parents, through Ishmael, through all the previous prophets of the Old Testament, all the way back to the beginning of time, to Adam. And you can see his lineage there in the notes. I'm not going to read it because the details are boring. But supposedly, according to Islamic historians, Muhammad can trace his lineage all the way back to the original parents, Adam and Eve. And he shows his lineage coming through Ishmael rather than Isaac. This is going to be significant later on. Now, various miracle stories surround the birth of Muhammad. I have another one of his biographies up here, written by Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir was a 14th century Islamic scholar. This is one volume of a 4-volume set of Muhammad's biography. But in this volume, Ibn Kathir mentions several supposedly miraculous stories that accompanied Muhammad's birth. For example, when Muhammad's mother, Amina, went to draw water from the Zamzam well. The Zamzam well is very significant in Islamic tradition, Islamic folklore. The Zamzam well, she would go to draw water, and the water in the well would rise up so that she didn't have to lower the bucket. It would rise up, and she would just have to scoop it off the top. Pretty interesting, huh? Why would water do that? According to another tradition in this book, when Muhammad was born, he was born already pre-circumcised. Well, that's pretty significant. How many males do you know that are born pre-circumcised? Supposedly, when Muhammad was born, as his mother Amina was giving birth to him, a light emanated from her all the way up into Syria. It lit up the whole Middle Eastern section of the world. And these are all recorded in the biography by Ibn Kathir. Supposedly, when Muhammad was born, some people came to visit him. And they asked what was significant about him. And as Amina is squatting giving birth, Muhammad drops out, picks up a handful of dirt, lifts up his head and said, "I have been sent as a prophet of God, as a newborn infant." Now, these are all the signs that Muslims use to say that, see, this wasn't just a natural, ordinary birth. These stories say that there's something significant about this guy when he was born. Look at all these things that happened that can't be ascribed to any other male child as he was born. So that's kind of the background behind Muhammad's birth. He was born in 570 A.D., died in 632 A.D., so he lived until he was about 63 years old. At age 40 years old, well, let me back up before that, even at age 25, he was married to his very first wife, Khadijah. Khadijah was 40 years old. Muhammad was 25, so she was 15 years his senior. The interesting part about this particular marriage is that Muhammad was initially hired by Khadijah as her business manager, as her business partner. She was a very wealthy woman. She had a very lucrative trading business, and she was looking for somebody to help manage her trading business up into Syria, up into Iraq, and so forth. And Muhammad was known around town as being a very honest man, very respectful man, very hard worker. And so word got to Khadijah that there was this man that could be trusted to manage her trading business, to help her as a business partner. So Khadijah hired him. Khadijah hired Muhammad to be a business manager. Eventually, they ended up getting married because Khadijah was just enthralled with Muhammad's honesty and decency and hard work. So he married Khadijah. He was 25 years old. She was 40 years old. He was faithful to Khadijah for 25 years. He was monogamous with her. She was his only wife. After she died, Muhammad took on multiple wives after that. According to some historians, he had up to 17 wives. 11 at any one time. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when we talk about the Quran and even further when we get into women in Islam. What allowed Muhammad to do that, take on multiple wives? But it's interesting that Muhammad was monogamous to Khadijah, and she hired him to be his business manager. We're going to get back to that a little bit later because that's going to become significant. He also had many other wives. One of the well-known facts of Muhammad that is spoken about within Christian circles anyway, and many people use this as a way to kind of bash Muhammad, is that he had a very young wife, Aisha. Aisha was the daughter of Muhammad's first male convert to Islam, a gentleman by the name of Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was the first successor of the Muslim community after Muhammad died, but Abu Bakr had a young daughter, Aisha. She was 6 years old, and Abu Bakr gave her in marriage to Muhammad when she was 6 years old, and Muhammad consummated that marriage with her when she was 9 years old. Now, some people use that as an argument against Muhammad and say he was a pedophile. Other Muslims, and even some critical scholars today say, well, that may or may not be so because in that particular time frame, in that culture, marrying young girls was just part of the culture. That may be. It is said, according to some historians in the Bible, that Mary, when she was pregnant with Jesus, was a very young woman, maybe 12 to 14 years old. And so, culturally, maybe marrying young girls at that age was appropriate. The question we have to answer, though, is it appropriate for today? Are young girls today physically ready for the results of marriage, and particularly pregnancy and childbirth? We'll get into that in a few weeks. So Muhammad was born in Mecca. An interesting thing happened one night. It's called the night flight, or the Miraj. It's based on a verse in the Quran, Surah 17, verse 1. And this is significant because Muslims believe that this is one of the examples that provide proof that Muhammad was a prophet of God. Supposedly one night Muhammad was sleeping and he was awakened from his sleep by the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel had sent down from heaven a mythical-looking creature, kind of a crossbreed between a horse, a mule with wings on it, and had the face of a human being. And the name of this animal was Barak. And supposedly Muhammad was placed on the back of Buraq, flown from Mecca. Some of you are snickering. That's okay. See, Hussein is not his only Islamic name. Buraq is Islamic as well. Some people don't know this, but so supposedly Muhammad was placed on the back of Buraq, taken from Mecca up to what's called the northernmost mosque. And Muslims believe this to be the Masjid al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount Mosque, the mosque that's there on the Temple Mount next to the Dome of the Rock. And it was when Muhammad was taken to the Temple Mount, deposited on the Temple Mount next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. At that point, supposedly a ladder came down out of heaven, and Muhammad was able to climb the ladder and ascend up through the 7 levels of heaven. Now, as he ascended through each of the levels of heaven, he was met by a different biblical prophet. He was met by Adam, and then by Moses, and then by David, and so forth, until he got all the way up to the 7th level of heaven, where he was able to speak to Allah, even though Allah was behind a screen. He couldn't see him face to face, but he was able to communicate and have a conversation with Allah. And the conversation involved how many prayers a day are Muslims supposed to pray toward Allah. This was the question that Muhammad asked. What would you have my people do? And supposedly Allah said, well, you must pray to me 50 times a day. 50. 50 times a day. So Muhammad goes, okay. So he comes back down to level 5 of heaven where he meets Moses. And Moses says, so what did Allah ask of you? And Muhammad says, well, he says we got to pray 50 times a day. Moses said, no. My people weren't able to do that. Your people aren't going to be able to keep that as well. You go back up and you start bargaining with God. Tell him this is impossible. So Muhammad goes back up to the 7th level of heaven, says, I can't do this. We can't do this. I can't pray 50 times a day. So supposedly Allah says, well, okay, how about 45 times a day? So he comes back down, talks to Moses 45 times a day. Nah, you go back up and this is impossible. You can't do that. Well, this goes back and forth a number of times until finally God tells Muhammad, you got to pray 5 times a day. Comes back down to Moses, and Moses says, well, okay, maybe. And Muhammad says, well, I'm not going to go back up and bargain anymore. I'm tired of this. So 5 times a day it is. This is where Muslims get the idea that you got to pray 5 times a day. Because this is what Muhammad did when he came back down from that experience. He told his people, God told me we must pray 5 times a day. That is one of our requirements. This is where the idea comes from, because 5 times a day prayer is not found in the Quran anywhere. It's based on this story, which some believe to be mythological. Now, where have you heard of another example where somebody bargained with God similar to that? Abraham, yeah. Will you destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for 50 righteous people? Will you destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for 40 righteous people? How about 30? How about 20? How about 10? See, much of the material that is in the Quran is borrowed from Jewish sources, from the Old Testament and from the New Testament, but particularly the Old Testament. This is one story, it's believed, where Muhammad borrowed the idea and kind of modified it to fit what he wanted it to say. There seems to be a lot of parallels there about a prophet of God bargaining with God and getting God to change his mind. So that's the significance of the night flight. That's where they get the 5 times a day prayer from. The Miraj, on the back of Buraq. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, in 622 AD, after facing increasing persecution from the Meccan people, Muhammad moved to Medina. This particular event marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar in 622 AD. So today when you go to an Islamic website, you'll see them date their calendar from this particular event. It's called the Hijrah. And every Islamic calendar, every event in Islam is dated according to this event. Today we are in the year 1433 AH, after Hijrah, on the Islamic calendar. So Muhammad moves to Medina with a couple hundred of his followers. And over the next 10 years, from 622 to 632, Muhammad was engaged in multiple conquests based out of Medina to capture all the Arabian Peninsula for Islam. We covered that extensively last week when we talked about jihad, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just remember this fact. Muhammad was single-handedly responsible for the elimination of every last Jew on the Arabian Peninsula. We talked about some of the battles that he was engaged in last week. The Battle of Badr, the Battle of the Trench. He personally was involved in 29 campaigns. Bill Federer mentioned this a few weeks ago. He himself was involved personally in 29 campaigns, supervised or oversaw 57 others for no less than, on an average, about 9 wars or conflicts per year in the last 10 years of his life. And that's why the last 10 years of his life are known by historians as the years of wars, the years of Muhammad's battles. Now, one of the issues that we talked about last week, and I'll briefly mention this again, is this issue of abrogation. One of the verses that Muslims use to try to convince us that Islam is a peaceful religion is Surah 2, verse 256, which says, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." You know, the truth will separate itself out from error. But when you look at these last 10 years of Muhammad's life, you see something completely different. You see that there actually was compulsion, and Muhammad actually endorsed it. For example, Muhammad sent his men to the people of the Bin al-Harith and told them to accept Islam within 3 days or be prepared to fight. So they were told, if you will accept Islam, you'll be safe. So they accepted Islam as it was given to them. So we see something quite different than what Muslims tell us today. They say, well, Islam will never compel somebody to become a Muslim. But Muhammad actually emulated and endorsed compulsion toward Islam in the last 10 years of his life. Why this conflicting information? Again, it's all based on abrogation. And we talked about that last week, so I don't want to go over that again. The significance of the Sunnah. Again, I mentioned this, verse 33:21 in the Quran talks about Muhammad being an example that every Muslim is to emulate. What Muhammad said and did is what every Muslim ought to say and do. Andrew Rippon, a secular scholar of Islamic studies, wrote a very scholarly book on Islam, and he makes this comment in his book. He says, the Sunnah is the practice of Muhammad as embodied in the Hadith and transmitted faithfully by Muhammad's followers through successive generations to the present. It represents the picture-perfect way of life in imitation of the precedent of Muhammad, who was the perfect embodiment of the will of God. Notice that last phrase, Muhammad, Muslims believe, is the perfect embodiment of the will of God. When Muhammad was given the Quran, supposedly this Quran is the will of God as dictated by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. But you won't find a lot of details in here about what Muslims are supposed to do. For example, the 5 daily prayers. That's not in here. How much zakat, how much obligatory alms are supposed to give. The details aren't in here. These are general principles that were laid out. The details, as Muslims believe, were given by Muhammad himself as he lived his life and applied the injunctions of the Quran that were given to him. So Muhammad's life was essentially, and many scholars will agree with this, Muhammad's life is his living commentary on what the Quran says, if you want to look at it that way. That's why Muslims believe that when Muhammad says and does something, he is acting in accordance with what the Quran says he's supposed to do. So they use Muhammad's life and his example as a commentary for what they're supposed to do as laid out in the Quran. So he's a living commentary. That's what Andrew Rippon means by this particular phrase. So that's kind of a brief historical background on Muhammad's life. We're going to come back to some of those facts in a moment because we're going to now answer the question, is Muhammad a prophet of God? This is where we want to get to today. And before the break, I want to cover the 4 criteria that Muslims use in their defense of Muhammad as a prophet. We're going to go over those 4 criteria in some explicit detail. There actually are many good things that can be said about Muhammad. He was a strong military leader. He was very astute politically. He did have a special place in his heart, as I mentioned a few times for orphans and widows. He cared about the poor. He cared about the disadvantaged. When the men went off to fight in battle and the men were killed, he had compassion on the widows that they left behind, and so made a provision for them to be cared for afterwards. And so he had a lot of noble traits that can be spoken about. But noble traits doesn't make somebody a prophet of God. You know, many of the qualities that Muslims point to about Muhammad can be spoken about and said about many significant leaders in world history. That doesn't make them any sort of a special man. This means they were good, moral people. Was he a prophet of God, though? That's the question we've got to answer. And so let's take a look at a few criteria that Muslims use to show that Muhammad was a prophet of God. They talk about a supernatural witness. They point to the fact that Muhammad was illiterate. They point to the fact that Muhammad actually spoke about prophecy. He had divine foreknowledge of a future event. And they say that Muhammad's prophetic call was attested to by way of miracles. So we're going to look at each of these four criteria briefly, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and look at the biblical criteria for Muhammad as a prophet and see if he matches up to those biblical criteria. Because the biblical criteria are not the same as these criteria. These are the ones that Muslims use to say he was a prophet of God. Let's first talk about his supernatural witness. Around 610 AD, at the age of 40 years old, Muhammad was visited supposedly by the angel Gabriel. This was his very first supernatural revelation that was given to him. He was meditating in a cave outside Mecca. It's called Mount Hira. Many Muslims actually climb to Mount Hira today when they're in Mecca as part of their Hajj, because they want to visit the place where Muhammad received his very first revelation. So he was meditating one night, as he used to do many times. It is said that Muhammad used to meditate for a full month every year. This was kind of his normal cycle. He would go to Mount Hira every year for one particular month and begin meditating. And one night, as he was meditating, he was supposedly visited by the angel Gabriel. And I want to read to you from his biography his meditation and his visitation and the revelation that he was given in his very first visitation by the angel Gabriel. It says the first revelation which began to be revealed to the apostle of Allah was a correct dream and sleep. He did not dream, but it came like the morning dawn. So some people believe that Muhammad was just dreaming. This is nothing more than a vision he had, rather than an actual visitation. But as you'll see in a moment, it was either a very wild dream or it was actually a visitation that he had by a spiritual being of some sort. It says, thereafter the loneliness became dear to him, and he used to seclude himself to the cave of Hira and engage therein in deep devotion for many nights. So he'd go to cave, meditate for many nights, run out of food, go back home, reprovision himself, and then go back up to the cave again. The angel appeared before him one night and said, read, or recite. The word can be translated in the Arabic either way. Recite is actually what the Quran means. It means the recitation. So the angel Gabriel visited him, and the very first word out of his mouth was recite, or read. Muhammad said, I cannot read, I cannot recite. Then he took me and pressed me hard till there came a great exhaustion on me. Thereafter he let me off and he said, read. And I said, I cannot read. Then he took me and pressed me hard for the second time until there appeared a great exhaustion on me. Thereafter he let me off. And he said a third time, read. And I said, I cannot read. Then he took me and pressed me a third time until there appeared a great exhaustion on me, and thereafter he let me off. And he said, read or recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Recite, and your Lord is most generous, who taught with a pen, taught man what he knew not. Then the prophet returned therewith, his heart trembling, and he went to Khadijah and said, wrap me up, wrap me up. Then they wrapped him up until the dread went away from him. Now picture this. Here's Muhammad's very first angelic revelation, his very first supernatural witness. He's meditating, and the angel Gabriel appears in front of him. He says, read, Muhammad. He says, I can't read. So what's Gabriel do? Boom! He body slams Muhammad. Presses him. Muhammad says he presses him against a rock until I can no longer breathe. I almost passed out from the exhaustion of it, is the sense. Thereafter, Gabriel let him off. Gabriel says, read again. I just told you I can't read. Body slams him again. Lets him off, lets him catch a breath. Read, Muhammad. I can't read, man. Body slams him again. Then he says, read. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. This is Surah 96. Surah 96, verses 1 to 5, is Muhammad's very first recorded revelation. Now, I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I'll reiterate it again. When you read the Quran is not in chronological order. It's in order based on, essentially, the chapters in the front with the longest verses, and the chapters near the end are the shorter chapters with fewer verses. Chapter 96 of the Quran was Muhammad's very first revelation, but it appears almost toward the end of the book. So when you read the Quran, you're not getting a chronological story. So I just wanted to make that clear. Somebody was asking about that last week during the break. But this was Muhammad's very first revelation, Surah 96, verses 1 to 5. And what did his very first supernatural visitation leave him feeling like? Was he in a state of joy? Was he in a state of exhilaration? No, he ran home to Khadijah, shaking and trembling, and said, wrap me up, wrap me up. Khadijah wrapped a blanket around him and held him close until Muhammad quit quivering from the fear that he experienced. His very first revelation left Muhammad fearful. Now contrast that with visitations by the angel Gabriel that we see in the Bible. Because I think we see something completely different. In Daniel chapter 8, verses 15 to 17, the angel Gabriel visits Daniel, and Daniel says, so he came near to where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face, but he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision that I'm giving you is for the time of the end. So Daniel is initially somewhat taken aback. He says he's frightened, but what does angel Gabriel do? He doesn't body slam him. He tries to comfort him. He says, don't be afraid. I'm giving you a vision of the end times. In Luke chapter 1, verse 13, the angel Gabriel again comes to announce the pregnancy of John the Baptist. The soon coming of John the Baptist. And he talks to Zechariah. The angel said to him, don't be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. You shall call his name John. So what does the angel Gabriel tell Zechariah? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. What's he tell Daniel? Don't be afraid. I'm giving you a vision of the end. Luke chapter 1, verse 26, when the angel Gabriel comes to visit Joseph and Mary to announce the birth of Jesus, to announce that Mary is pregnant with the Son of God. Again, the angel said to her, don't be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. So I think we see two different angel Gabriels here at work. The angel Gabriel that visited Muhammad left him in a state of fear, left him in a state of, what am I going to do with this? Khadijah had to wrap him up and comfort him. But the angel Gabriel that we see visiting these people in the Bible, Daniel and Elizabeth and Zechariah and Mary and Joseph, what did he say? Don't be afraid. Two different angel Gabriels? I think so. So if the angel Gabriel isn't who actually visited Muhammad, then who was it? I'm not going to answer that question. But it doesn't seem to be the same angel Gabriel that we're familiar with. So remember, Muhammad's very first initial visitation left him in a state of fear. Now, his wife Khadijah had a very interesting way of trying to discern whether this really was an angel or not, or whether it was some sort of demonic being, because Muhammad's very first words out of his mouth when he went home, Khadijah, he says, woe is me, poet or possessed. Never will the Quraysh say this of me. I'm going to go up the mountainside and I'm going to throw myself over the mountainside and be done with this dread that's captivating me in fear. he actually thought, his very first impression was that he was demonically possessed. And he was going to commit suicide by jumping over the side of the mountain so that the Quraysh, his tribe, would never call him a madman. His initial idea was he was demonically possessed. So he went home to his wife Khadijah, and she had a very interesting way of discerning whether it was a demon speaking to him and appearing to him, or whether it was really an angelic being. She sits down. She says, Muhammad, come here and sit on my left thigh. So Muhammad comes and sits on his left thigh, and she says, can you still see the vision? Yeah, I can. Okay, come here and sit on my right thigh. So he sits on her right thigh, and she says, well, can you still see the vision? Yeah, I still see it. Well, she stands up, and according to some accounts, she disrobes herself. According to other accounts, she takes her robe and actually envelops Muhammad inside it. And then she asks him, do you still see the vision? He says, no, the vision's gone. And she says, oh, well then it really is an angel speaking to you. That's rather an odd way to put the thing to the test, don't you think? But the idea behind this is when she disrobed herself and showed her naked body to Muhammad, an angel would not stick around in that situation. He fled. Whereas a demon would have stuck around to, take in the scenery. So since Muhammad said, I can no longer see the vision, she says, well, it must be an angel because he's gone now. That was her reasoning. Kind of an interesting little bit of trivia there. But this is Muhammad's supernatural witness. Now I want to talk about another supernatural witness that Muhammad had. It's known as the Satanic Verses. How many of you have ever heard of the Satanic Verses? Okay. Yeah, there was a book written some years ago, about 20 years ago, I think, or so, by Salman Rushdie, a novel, written by this title, The Satanic Verses. And he actually based it on this particular incident in Islamic history. And because Salman Rushdie dared expose into public view this particular incident in Muhammad's life, he was threatened with his life. In fact, there's a $5 million bounty on his head right now. He still lives in isolation. But the Satanic Verses is a very interesting issue, because here we're going to discover another problem in Islamic theology. Supposedly one night Muhammad was in his state of meditation again, and an angel visited him whom he thought was the angel Gabriel and gave him the following revelation, which is found in the Quran in Surah 53, verses 19 through 22. And those verses in the Quran say, have you considered Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third one? These are exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for, whose intercession is to be obtained. Now let's go back in history a little bit. Remember, Muhammad was in Mecca. This happened in Mecca. This is a Meccan verse. Muhammad is preaching this new monotheistic religion, that there's only one God worthy of worship, and all the other 359 gods of the Meccan society were false gods. And so because of that, he's facing persecution, increasing persecution until he flees to Medina in 622. But around, this particular incident happened around 616 or 617, that time frame. Muhammad is looking for a way to buy some time for his followers. He's looking for a way to appease the Meccans somewhat and help ease up on the persecution that they're facing. And so he has a vision one night. And he says in the Quran, have you thought about Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat? These are three of the female deities that the Meccans worshipped, of their 360 gods. They were said to be daughters of Allah. Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, three female deities. Muhammad in these verses recognized them as legitimate gods as well as Allah, and said these are people who can intercede for you in heaven. When Muhammad uttered these three words, have you thought about Allah, Al-Uzza, Manat? These are intercessors whose intercession can be obtained. The Meccans looked at him and said, wow, well, he's not such a bad guy after all. See, he's recognizing our other three gods. And so it achieved what Muhammad had set out to do. The persecution let up for a while. Muhammad was welcomed back into the Meccan society again, and all was well. Until The angel Gabriel came to him a short time later and said, Muhammad, what in the world have you done? God did not give you those words. Those words were put on your tongue by Satan himself. That's why they're called the satanic verses. Now, many Muslims today will argue that this story has no basis in fact. It never occurred. You'll hear that argument if you bring up this particular incident in Islamic history. Well, that never occurred. That's just myth. Well, look at the following verse then. If it never occurred, then why was Muhammad given an excuse in Surah 22:52? See, after Muhammad admitted that Satan had tricked him and put these verses on his tongue that actually acknowledged these three other pagan gods as valid gods, Muhammad confessed, and then he was given another revelation, Surah 22:52, which says, and we did not send before you any messenger or prophet, but when he desired, Satan made a suggestion respecting his desire. But Allah annuls that which Satan casts. Then does Allah establish his communication, for Allah is all-knowing and all-wise. In other words, what this verse says is, Muhammad, don't worry about what you just did. Other prophets before you have been tricked by Satan as well. And they've said things that Satan put on their tongues, but God came along afterwards and corrected them. So you're in a long line of good company. You're keeping good company because all prophets before you have suffered the same thing that you just went through. Don't worry about it. God's going to come along and correct you. Now, first of all, has any other biblical prophet given words as prophetic revelation that were given to him by Satan? Where's the evidence for that? There is none. This is what I call a just-in-time revelation that Muhammad is famous for. Bill Federer mentioned these things a couple weeks ago. Muhammad, every time he finds himself in a pickle, goes into a trance supposedly and receives another revelation that absolves him of the very thing that he's accused of doing. This is one instance. He's accused of accepting as revelation from God words that were put on his tongue by Satan. So he goes into a trance, receives another revelation that says, oh, Muhammad, don't worry about it. All the other prophets before you have suffered the same problem. You're in good company. Don't worry about it. God will come along and correct it every time it happens. A just-in-time revelation to get him out of his pickle. Here's the problem. If Muhammad received a revelation that he thought was from God, but actually, by his own admission, was from Satan himself, then that tells me that he's unable to make a distinction between divine revelation and satanic revelation. He has no discernment. Which means, why should we trust anything that's written in here? Maybe it was all satanically inspired. How do we know? Muhammad couldn't tell the difference. Is that a valid question? I think so. If Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between divine inspiration and satanic inspiration, then I have no reason to trust anything written in this book. In fact, what was Muhammad's very first idea? Woe is me, poet or possessed? Never will the Quraysh say this of me. So, his revelation, supernatural witness. Another attribute that Muslims point to is the fact that Muhammad was illiterate. And how can an illiterate man produce such a work as this? Muhammad, is said, couldn't read or write. And so because Muhammad couldn't read or write, how in the world could an illiterate person put together a work of poetry? And much of the Quran is written in poetic prose. It's a poetic book. An illiterate man wouldn't have been able to produce such a work as this, so the saying goes. Therefore, since Muhammad was given the Quran and gave the Quran to Muslims, even as an illiterate man, that shows that he's a prophet of God. Because an illiterate man wouldn't have been able to do that. Excuse me. Well, there's a problem with this particular argument. First of all, it's doubtful that Muhammad was illiterate at all. When you read the hadith, when you read the accounts of tradition attributed to Muhammad, we find several times in the hadith where Muhammad is asked for a pen and paper to write something. So if he's going to write something, how in the world can he be illiterate? For example, when he married Aisha, when he married Abu Bakr's 6-year-old daughter, it is said in the hadith, Muhammad wrote the contract with Aisha when she was 6 years old. Now, how in the world can an illiterate man write a marriage contract? Doesn't seem to be possible. On his deathbed, as Muhammad was dying from the result of being poisoned by a Jewish woman who fed him a poisoned leg of lamb, on his deathbed, he asked for pen and paper to write his final instructions to his followers. So again, even in their own traditions, it seems like this idea that Muhammad was illiterate cannot be supported by Islamic tradition. Secondly, remember what Khadijah hired Muhammad to do. Remember, I mentioned she married him because she was enamored with the way that he conducted her business, managed her business transactions. She hired him initially as a business manager, right? And eventually ended up marrying him. Now, why in the world would Khadijah hire a business manager who can't read and write, can't record the business transactions and keep track of what's going on with the business? Does that make any sense at all? So again, we see that there's probably not support that Muhammad was illiterate. But here's the most important part. What does it matter? How can this be a sign that Muhammad was a prophet, being illiterate, when Muhammad didn't write the Quran at all anyway? He didn't write the Quran. He never ordered the Quran to be written down during his lifetime. So, how is it a miracle that an illiterate man didn't write a book? You follow that train of thought? Who cares if he's illiterate? He didn't write it anyway, so how can this be a sign that he's a prophet of God? An illiterate man didn't write a book. Well, there's nothing significant about that. No illiterate man writes a book. So why is this even a criteria? It's illogical. It doesn't make sense. So he's illiterate. So what? Again, prophecy. Next point. Muslims believe that Muhammad is a prophet of God based on the fact that he uttered prophetic prophecy. He had divine foreknowledge of a certain event happening. And they get this idea based on one particular verse, or one section of verses in the Quran, from Surah 30. Now, we have in our Bible many examples of prophetic divine foreknowledge of future events. There are over 300 prophecies of Jesus that were uttered by the Old Testament prophets. Where he would be born, how he would be born, how he would live his life, where he would be crucified, the details around his crucifixion, that they would gamble for his clothing and that a bone wouldn't be broken, and on it goes. Written 700 years in advance of the event. Specific detail. We have specific detail of other prophetic events about the order to rebuild Jerusalem, which occurred 150 years later after that prophetic utterance was uttered and recorded in the Bible in Isaiah. And so we have many, many examples in the Bible of divine prophetic foreknowledge. Foreknowledge that people had in extreme detail of events to occur hundreds of years later. What kind of prophecy do we have along those same lines in the Quran? Do we have anything that measures up to that level of prophecy? Well, the only example Muslims can point to is Surah 30, verses 1 to 4. And there's not much there. Surah 31 to 4 says, "The Roman Empire has been defeated in a land close by. But they, even after this defeat of theirs, will soon be victorious. Within a few years, with Allah is the decision in the past and in the future, and on that day shall the believers rejoice." Now, this is talking about an ongoing battle that had been going on for decades between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. The Byzantines and the Persians, they were constantly at battle with one another. And the Persians would win a war, the Byzantines would regroup, get stronger, they'd go to battle again, and the Byzantines would win. The Persians would regroup, they'd get stronger again, and they'd go to war, and they would capture again. This had been going on for a number of years. So what Muhammad is suggesting here in this particular section of the Quran, he says the Roman Empire has been defeated. The Byzantines have been defeated. He's using the term Roman Empire to refer to the Byzantine kingdom, the Byzantine Empire. Even though the Roman Empire historically was defeated around 475 AD. But he says the Roman Empire has been defeated in a land close by, but soon they're going to be victorious. In other words, they just suffered a defeat, but there's going to be another battle coming again shortly, and the Byzantines are going to be victorious again. How in the world is this divine foreknowledge? Where's the specificity? It's going to happen in a few years. Not hundreds of years like we find in the Bible, but a few years. And Muhammad essentially was doing nothing more than taking an educated guess because he'd seen these guys battling one another for decades. The Persians would win, then the Byzantines would win, the Persians would win, the Byzantines would win. And what's he saying here? Well, the Byzantines just lost, but they're going to be victorious again. Well, yeah, duh. This is what's been going on. This is the pattern that's been going on for years. He's not making any divine foreknowledge. He's not making a divine prophecy. He's just looking at a recurring pattern in history. And he's basically saying, well, these guys are going to go to war again, and even though the Roman Empire lost the last battle, they're going to be victorious. Well, yeah. Essentially, he's taking a coin and flipping it and saying, heads I win, tails you lose. And he got a lucky guess. But he didn't get a lucky guess because it wasn't lucky at all. This was a pattern that he had been seeing going on back and forth for decades and decades. And so he knew what the outcome was going to be in the next battle. Yet Muslims point to this and say, see, Muhammad knew that this event was going to happen. Therefore, he's a prophet. He had prophetic foreknowledge. Does that measure up to the level of prophecy that we see in the Bible today? Not even close. Not even close. And then finally, miracles. Muslims say that Muhammad performed miracles. One of the divine miracles that Muslims point to, and there's actually a book by this title, I didn't bring it today, it's called The Splitting of the Moon. Muhammad supposedly split the moon one time, and this is in tradition. It says Muhammad split the moon asunder, which means he split it in half, and he placed half the moon on that side of the mountain and half the moon on this side of the mountain. Muslim apologists today will even say, you know, when the guys landed on the moon, they actually noticed there's a big crevice in the moon. NASA confirms that there's a huge crevice in the moon. That gives scientific proof that Muhammad split the moon one time. You can go to NASA today and see it. There's pictures of it. Well, first of all, there's not. But this is the common argument that's made among Muslim apologetic circles. But second of all, let's look at this particular miracle account and see if it actually makes any sense logically. It is said that Muhammad split the moon and he put the moon on half of the moon on that side of the mountain, half the moon on this side of the mountain. Well, here's a picture of what they're suggesting. Right here in our own backyard, we have the San Gabriel Mountains up here, where Mount Wilson and the Mount Wilson Observatory and Big Bear, that's all part of the San Gabriel Mountain range. Now, if Muhammad actually did what Muslims claim he did, and split the moon and put half of it on that side of the San Gabriel Mountains and half of it on this side of the San Gabriel Mountains, what would it look like? Here's an approximate representation of the diameter of the moon compared to the United States of America. Okay? So Muhammad's going to take this moon and put half of it on this side of the San Gabriel Mountains and half of it on this side. So what's that look like? If this had actually happened, nobody would be alive to tell the tale because they would be crushed under the weight of the moon. If half the moon was put on this side of the San Gabriel Mountains, we wouldn't be alive to talk about it. Well, this is nothing more than mythology. It doesn't stand up against critical scrutiny. It's nothing more than a myth. When you look at Muhammad's words in the Quran regarding this idea of whether he can perform miracles or not, he denies the ability to do any miracles. So we know every time Muslims bring up this idea of Muhammad splitting the moon or any one of a number of other miracles they claim Muhammad actually did, it goes against what Muhammad claimed for himself as recorded in the Quran. In Surah 17, verses 90 to 93, remember, when Muhammad went to Medina, he presented himself to the Jews of Medina as another prophet. And so they put him to the test. They wanted to find out, are you really a prophet? So they ask him, and it's recorded in Surah 17, verse 90 to 93. They say, we shall not believe in thee until thou cause a spring to gush forth for us from the earth. Who does that sound like? Moses, right? Hit a rock, make water come out of the earth? Or until you have a garden of date trees and vines, or cause rivers to gush forth in their midst, carrying abundant water. Or you cause the sky to fall in pieces, and you say, as you say, will happen against us. Or until you bring Allah and the angels before us face to face. Or you have a house adorned with gold, or you mount a ladder right into the skies. No, we shall not even believe in thy mounting until thou send down to us a book that we could read. So here's the Jews, here's the people, here's Muhammad's skeptics saying, you call yourself a prophet? Bring us a sign. Bring me something I can hang my hat on. Make water gush forth from the earth where there is no water. Or make a tree that's barren suddenly burst forth with dates. Or give me some sort of a sign that I can hang my hat on. Like we see in Old Testament prophets. That's all they're asking for. They're asking for a miracle. What's Muhammad's response? Glory to my Lord. Am I only a man, a messenger? In other words, Muhammad said, you're asking me for a sign of a miracle, but I can't do a miracle. I'm only a messenger of God. And time and again in the Quran, Muhammad denies the ability to perform a miracle. So every time we see Muhammad performing a miracle in Islamic folklore, we know it's nothing more than legendary accounts. Either that or the Quran's wrong. No Muslim will say the Quran is wrong. When Muhammad denied the ability to do miracles, a Muslim must abide by that. And so when Muhammad is said to do miracles, that goes against what the Quran says. What Muhammad said about himself, as recorded in the Quran. So, what are the Muslim arguments for Muhammad as a prophet? His supernatural witness. We know about that. He had a very supernatural witness from Satan himself, which doesn't seem to be grounds for considering him to be a prophet. The fact that he was illiterate, the fact that he performed miracles, all these are what Muslims use to point to Muhammad as a prophet, and we see how every one of them falls short. Based on Islam's own accounts, I have no reason to believe why Muhammad is to be considered a prophet. Well, let's take a break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the biblical criteria we see for a prophet and see how Muhammad measures up. We're going to put Muhammad to a critical test after the break.